The air in the laboratory tasted of filtered sterility and ambition, a scent that clung to the back of Keo's throat like a fine dust. He moved through the high-security corridors, a ghost in a world of polished chrome and humming servers, his presence barely registering against the confident strides of his colleagues. They were titans in lab coats, their conversations a rapid-fire exchange of acronyms and breakthroughs that left him trailing in their intellectual wake. Each biometric scan at the airlock doors felt like a judgment, the soft green glow of approval a fleeting reprieve from the constant, gnawing sense of being an imposter in a temple of genius. His workstation was a small island of relative quiet, bathed in the cool blue light of his monitor. The project designation, S9, glowed on the screen, a compound promising to redefine human cognitive potential. His task was mundane, a junior researcher's grunt work of collating and reviewing data streams from the preliminary animal trials. The numbers scrolled by, a river of seemingly perfect results, enhanced learning curves, improved problem-solving speeds. But as he delved deeper, cross-referencing logs with raw data files, a pattern of subtle inconsistencies began to emerge. Gaps in the chronological records of the primate subjects, periods of days, sometimes weeks, where the data was either missing entirely or replaced with a single, repeated baseline metric. It was the kind of oversight that could be easily dismissed as a clerical error, a system glitch. But to Ko, whose entire career was built on noticing the things others overlooked, it felt intentional, a deliberate erasure. His insecurity, that ever-present companion, fed the suspicion, twisting it from a professional curiosity into a personal quest. What if they were all missing something? What if he, the quiet one in the corner, was the only one who could see the crack in the foundation of this magnificent, corporate-backed edifice? The thought was intoxicating, a dangerous spark in the sterile environment. A moment of solitude found him in the break room, the industrial coffee machine gurgling like a discontented stomach. He stared at his reflection in the dark surface of the microwave door, a pale, anxious face framed by hair he'd forgotten to style properly. The desire for recognition was a physical ache, a hollow space beneath his ribs that yearned to be filled not just with praise, but with validation. He wanted to be the one who uncovered the truth, who stood before the board and presented the flaw that saved the project, and perhaps countless futures from disaster. It was a reckless, arrogant fantasy, born from a lifetime of feeling invisible. And as he returned to his desk, the anomalous gaps in the S9 data seemed to pulse on the screen, a silent siren call he no longer had the will to ignore. The stage was set not for caution but for a plunge into the unknown, fueled by a desperate need to matter. The archived servers were the laboratory's subconscious, a digital graveyard of abandoned protocols and forgotten failures, accessible only through a backdoor left open by sheer institutional neglect. Late that night, long after the last confident footstep had echoed down the corridor, Ko navigated this ghostly architecture. The hum of the cooling fans was a low, mournful dirge in the absolute silence, and the pale glow of his unauthorized terminal cast long, skeletal shadows across his face. His fingers flew across the keyboard, a frantic, illicit dance. He was no longer just a junior researcher. He was an archaeologist of truth, digging through layers of corporate sediment. He found them nestled between obsolete budget reports and outdated safety manuals, a cluster of files tagged for deletion, their metadata scrubbed but their core data stubbornly persistent, like ghosts refusing to cross over. They were the primate trial reports, the real ones. As he opened them, the sterile air of the lab turned, thick and heavy, pressing down on him. The data was not of enhanced learning or improved problem-solving. It was a chronicle of ruin. Timeline lapse videos showed rhesus macaques, once alert and curious, descending into a state of profound neurological decay. Their movements became jerky, uncoordinated, their once intelligent eyes clouding over with a vacant terror. Synaptic activity maps, which should have shown vibrant networks of firing neurons, instead displayed a creeping darkness, a cascading failure that consumed the brain from the inside out. The reports coldly noted the onset of catatonia, self-mutilation, and finally, cerebral necrosis, all within weeks of the first S9 administration. The dates aligned perfectly with the gaps he had found in the official records. The confrontation happened the next morning, a collision of his sleepless anxiety and the senior scientist's polished indifference. He cornered Dr. Aris in the main hallway, his voice a strained whisper as he tried to articulate his horrifying discovery. He spoke of the necrosis, the erased data, the ethical abyss they were staring into. Dr. Aris listened, a faint, patronizing smile playing on his lips, not even bothering to lower his voice. He dismissed it as corrupted data sets, the unfortunate but necessary casualties of aggressive research. We're rewriting the boundaries of human potential, Silva. You can't do that without breaking a few eggs, or a few monkeys. The words were not just a dismissal. They were a reassertion of the hierarchy, a reminder of Keo's place. The senior scientist clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture that felt like a brand of contempt, and walked away, leaving Keo standing alone in the bustling corridor, the phantom images of those decaying primates seared onto his retinas. The discovery became a specter that haunted his every waking moment. It colored the food in the cafeteria, giving it the taste of sawdust. It made the cheerful hum of the laboratory equipment sound like a swarm of locusts. The corporation was not just ambitious, it was monstrous, willing to pave its road to glory with shattered minds and deleted files. His mistrust, once a quiet seed, had now erupted into a tangled, choking vine. The official narrative was a lie, and the only person who seemed to care was the one nobody ever listened to. The injustice of it festered, boiling alongside his own desperate need to be proven right. He saw no path forward through official channels, no appeal to a morality that had clearly been excised from the project's core design. The haunting truth of those erased reports left him with only one terrifying conclusion. To understand the monster, he would have to look it directly in the eye. He would have to become a part of the experiment himself. The storage room was a forgotten lung of the laboratory, a cramped space smelling of dust, ozone, and the faint, metallic tang of old wiring. It was here, surrounded by obsolete server racks and discarded monitor husks, that Ko prepared to cross a line from which there could be no return. The vial of S9 felt unnaturally cold in his trembling hand, a sliver of captured potential that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The liquid within was a pale, pearlescent blue, shimmering with an inner light that promised everything and whispered of nothing. His breath hitched, a cloud in the chilled air, as he filled the syringe. The needle was a stark silver accusation against the dim light. Every rational instinct screamed at him to stop, to remember the hollowed-out eyes of the primates, to heed the cold, clinical warnings of the erased reports. But the memory of Dr. Aris's condescending smile was louder, a fresh brand of humiliation that burned away his fear and sealed his resolve. This was no longer just about truth. It was about transcendence. It was about proving he was more than just a ghost in the machine. He pressed the needle into the vein on his inner arm, the sharp sting, a punctuation mark in the silence. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then the world detonated. It was not a gentle awakening, but a violent, beautiful rupture. A tidal wave of pure, unfiltered information crashed over him, and instead of drowning, he breathed it in. The hum of the fluorescent light above him was no longer just a sound. It was a complex symphony of electrical frequencies, each harmonic distinct and decipherable. He could see the individual dust motes dancing in the air, Tracing parabolic arcs dictated by airflow patterns he could now calculate instinctively. The tangled mess of colored cables snaking from a broken server was no longer a chaos of wires, but a logical, elegant map of data pathways, their purpose and potential laid bare before him. He closed his eyes, and the unfinished equation that had plagued him for weeks, a stubborn knot of variables and constants, unraveled itself in his mind's eye. The solution was not reached through laborious steps, but presented itself whole, perfect, and blindingly obvious, as if it had been there all along, waiting for a consciousness clear enough to perceive it. A surge of power, raw and intoxicating, flooded his nervous system. The gnawing insecurity that had been his constant companion since childhood evaporated, replaced by a crystalline certainty. He was no longer Ko Silva, the anxious junior researcher. He was a nexus of intellect, a god of perception standing in a forgotten room. He felt invincible, untouchable, the master of every particle of reality that fell within his newly expanded senses. This was the promise of S9, and it was more glorious, more profound than any corporate briefing could have ever conveyed. It was not merely enhancement, it was apotheosis. The high was a perfect, crystalline peak, and he existed at its apex for what felt like an eternity. But all peaks have a downward slope. The first hint of the descent was subtle, a faint, throbbing pressure beginning to build. Behind his eyes, it was a distant drumbeat, easy to ignore amidst the symphony of his newfound genius. Yet it persisted, a small, dark crack in the brilliant facade. The exhilaration that had moments before felt like flight now carried a sharp, metallic edge of fear. The ghost of the primate's neurological decay flickered at the edge of his consciousness. This was not a free gift. This was a transaction, and the first, subtle payment was now being demanded. He stood in the silent, dusty room, the empty syringe at his feet, a man who had touched the sun and was now beginning to feel the burn. He was both a conqueror and a condemned man, exalted and terrified in the same breath. The world had been remade in the stark, brilliant aftermath of that first dose, and Kao could not bear to let it return to its mundane, monochrome state. The memory of that transcendent clarity became a siren song, and the small, pearlescent vial in his locked desk drawer was the only compass that could guide him back. He established a ritual, a sacred, secret rhythm to his days. Every morning, before the first colleague arrived and the fluorescent hum of the lab reached its full chorus, he would retreat to the sanitation closet. There, under the stark, white light, he would measure out a minuscule amount of S9, a dose so small it was almost homeopathic, a whisper of power meant to sustain him without breaking him. It was a tightrope walk over an abyss, and he believed with a fervent, desperate hope that he had found the perfect balance. The effects were not the explosive supernova of the initial dose, but a steady, brilliant dawn. His mind, once a cluttered attic of anxieties and half-formed thoughts, became a pristine library. Data streams from the S9 project, which had once been a confusing torrent, now resolved into elegant, logical patterns. He saw connections that had eluded the entire senior team, identifying a previously overlooked catalytic agent that was causing unpredictable metabolic decay in the compound's later stages. He drafted a new synthesis pathway in a single, feverish night, his fingers flying across the keyboard as if guided by an external force. When he presented his findings at the weekly progress meeting, the room fell into a stunned silence, broken only by Dr. Aris's slow, deliberate clap. The senior scientist's eyes, usually glazed with indifference, held a new, appraising light. Remarkable intuition, Silva. This is the kind of forward-thinking we need. The praise was a drug in itself, sweeter and more addictive than he could have imagined. For the first time, he was not invisible, he was indispensable. But the brilliance came at a cost, one that slowly bled into the edges of his life. The steady hum of intellectual clarity was accompanied by a low-grade, persistent irritability. The sound of a colleague chewing gum too loudly in the next cubicle became a maddening, percussive torture. The casual, meandering small talk that filled the break room felt like a willful assault on his precious, ordered thoughts. He found his jaw perpetually clenched, his responses to simple questions clipped and sharp. He was a god of logic trapped in a world of mundane, infuriating mortals. Sleep, once a refuge, became a disjointed and elusive phantom. He would lie in the dark, his mind still racing along the pristine tracks laid down by the S9, replaying complex protein folds and chemical equations against the back of his eyelids. When sleep did come, it was thin and fragile, populated by formless anxieties that left him more exhausted upon waking. The world outside his enhanced mind began to feel thick, syrupy. He noticed it first in the way people moved. A colleague reaching for a coffee mug seemed to drift through the air with impossible, languid slowness. The second hand on the lab's wall clock didn't just tick. It dragged itself from one marker to the next with a visible, agonizing effort. Time itself was stretching thin around him, while he burned with a frantic internal velocity. He was a man out of sync with the very fabric of reality, a bright, fast-burning star in a universe that was suddenly, inexplicably, slowing down. The praise and the breakthroughs were a glittering crown, but he could feel the first, hairline fractures spreading through his mind, a silent, creeping instability foreshadowing the collapse to come. The controlled burn of the microdoses was no longer a steady flame, but a wildfire raging through the architecture of his mind. The brilliant clarity that had once felt like a superpower now had a serrated edge, cutting him off from the world as much as it elevated him above it. The irritability that had been a minor nuisance swelled into a constant, low-frequency rage, a pressure cooker of resentment waiting for the slightest trigger. It found its release in the break room, over the communal coffee machine. Lena, a junior biochemist with a perpetually cheerful disposition, was describing her weekend in a bubbly, meandering monologue. The sound of her voice, the way she over-enunciated her vowels, the triviality of her story, it all grated against Keo's heightened senses like sandpaper on raw nerve endings. He didn't just feel annoyed, he felt a visceral, almost physical revulsion. Before he could leash the impulse, a snarl ripped from his throat. "Does every thought in your head need an audience?" The words were laced with a venom that shocked even him. The room fell silent. Lena's face crumpled, her smile dissolving into a mask of hurt and confusion. The other researchers stared, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and judgment. Keo turned away, his heart hammering, the brief flash of satisfaction immediately drowned in a cold wave of shame and self-loathing. He had become the very thing he despised, a bully, a monster of his own making. Sleep offered no sanctuary. When his exhausted mind finally surrendered to the void, it was not to rest but to a theater of horrors. His dreams were vivid, technicolor nightmares, drenched in a visceral dread. He was back in the archived server room, but the files were no longer on a screen. They were physical things, made of pulsing, wet flesh. He would try to open them, and his fingers would sink into the soft tissue, pulling back to reveal the hollowed-out skull of a rhesus macaque, its clouded eyes staring at him with accusatory intelligence. Other nights, he was strapped to a chair in the lab, forced to watch as his own reflection in the observation glass slowly deteriorated, its skin peeling back to reveal the same creeping darkness he had seen on the synaptic activity maps, his mind being consumed from the inside out. He would wake gasping, drenched in a cold sweat, the line between the nightmare and his waking reality blurring into a terrifying smear. Worse than the rage and the nightmares was the growing numbness. The small human joys that had once anchored him, the satisfaction of a well-solved problem, the warmth of the morning sun on his face, even the simple pleasure of a good meal, were fading, their colors leaching away into a uniform gray. He watched his colleagues laugh at a shared joke and felt nothing but a distant, clinical curiosity about the social mechanics of the interaction. He was a spectator in his own life, watching a film of a man named Ko Silva from behind a thick pane of soundproof glass. The S9 had not just enhanced his mind, it was systematically erasing his heart, replacing empathy with analysis and emotion with cold, hard data. The final, chilling manifestation of his unraveling came during the weekly lab meeting. As Dr. Aris stood at the head of the table, pointing to a complex molecular diagram on the screen, Ko's perception fractured. The senior scientist's movements became unnaturally sluggish, his arms sweeping through the air in a slow, viscous drag, his words stretching into deep, distorted groans. Around him, his colleagues nodded in agreement, their heads bobbing with the languid, underwater grace of deep-sea creatures. Ko looked from one face to another, seeing only blank, placid masks, their expressions fixed in a state of bovine incomprehension. They were trapped in molasses while his thoughts fired at the speed of light. A cold paranoia seized him. This wasn't just a side effect, it was a revelation. They were all in on it. Their slowness was a performance, a collective pretense designed to hide the true, horrifying nature of S9 from him. He was the only one who could see the world as it truly was, a slow, decaying sham, and he was the lone, accelerated witness to its inevitable collapse. The isolation was absolute, a prison of his own enhanced perception, and the walls were closing in fast. The paranoia was no longer a whispering doubt, but a cold, hard certainty that guided his hands through the digital labyrinth of the corporation's central database. The sluggish movements of his colleagues, the syrupy passage of time, they were not mere side effects. They were symptoms of a deeper, more deliberate deception. He worked with a frantic, focused energy, his S9 sharpened mind slicing through firewalls and security protocols as if they were tissue paper. He bypassed the official project logs and dove into the sub-basements of the server architecture, into the encrypted partitions where the real truths were buried. The data here was not sanitized for review boards or investor presentations. It was raw, brutal, and unflinching. He had gone looking for the ghosts of primates, but he found the echoes of men. The file was labeled Prometheus Protocol. Inside, a grim chronology unfolded. Human trials. They had begun over 2 years ago, long before the first official primate study was ever logged. The subjects were listed by codes, not names, but their profiles were chillingly specific. Disgraced academics, indebted volunteers, individuals from the fringes of society who would not be missed. The records were a clinical dissection of human ruin. Initial reports noted the same explosive cognitive leaps Ko himself had experienced, subjects solving grand unified theories, composing symphonies in a single sitting, predicting market fluctuations with supernatural accuracy. But the subsequent entries charted a steep and horrifying descent. Progress notes, written in the same detached, technical language used to describe the macaques, documented the rapid onset of acute psychosis. Subject P04 began reporting that his own memories were being edited by unseen technicians. Subject P11 developed the unshakable delusion that everyone around him was a sophisticated automaton and spent his final, lucid hours trying to find the power switch on his attending physician. The most harrowing accounts detailed a profound erosion of self. Case files described subjects who could no longer recognize their own reflections, who forgot the names of their children, whose core personalities seemed to dissolve like sugar in water, leaving behind only a hollow, hyperintelligent shell. One log entry for subject P19 simply read, "The identity construct has collapsed. The vessel remains, but the occupant is gone." They weren't just losing their minds. They were being systematically unmade, their very essence consumed as fuel for the temporary blaze of genius. The corporation's cover-up was not merely about hiding dead monkeys. It was about burying the evidence of its most monstrous crime, the deliberate, calculated destruction of human souls in the pursuit of an impossible godhood. Ko sat back, the sterile light of the monitor bleaching the color from his face. The buzzing in his ears was not the hum of the servers, but the scream of all those erased minds, a chorus of the damned whose only monument was this cold, digital tomb. He had wanted to uncover a corporate secret, but he had exhumed a graveyard. The ghostly chorus of the erased subjects from the Prometheus Protocol screamed in the silence of Ko's skull, a psychic wound that bled into every thought. The sterile laboratory air now tasted of ash and deceit. He moved through the corridors like an automaton, his colleagues sluggish, deliberate movements no longer a source of paranoid speculation, but a confirmed horror. They were either ignorant pawns or willing participants in a system that treated human consciousness as expendable fuel. His own microdosed clarity felt like a profane thing, a stolen power drenched in the blood of those who had been unmade before him. He had to know more. He had to find the endpoint, the final, terrible truth of what S9 did to a person. Driven by a compulsion that bordered on self-destruction, he plunged back into the encrypted depths of the database, navigating with the cold, precise logic the substance afforded him. He bypassed the main Prometheus folder, sensing it was a curated exhibit of the damned. He needed the raw archives, the unedited footage of the catastrophe. His search led him to a server partition so deeply buried it felt less like a digital space and more like a forgotten catacomb. The directory was a string of meaningless alphanumerics, but one folder name stood out, its label a punch to his gut. Subject C. His hand, usually so steady at the keyboard, trembled as he clicked it open. The contents were sparse, a single image file and a text log. The image loaded with agonizing slowness, pixel by pixel, constructing a reality he was not prepared to see. It was a standard corporate ID photograph, the background a bland, light blue screen. The face staring back at him was younger, the hair slightly different, the eyes brighter and untouched by the weary cynicism he saw in the mirror each morning. But it was undeniably, horrifyingly, his own face. The world did not so much tilt as it simply dissolved. The hum of the server racks faded into a distant, meaningless whine. The polished floor beneath his feet seemed to lose its solidity. He was floating, unmoored, staring at the ghost of himself. A cold, nauseating shock flooded his system, so profound it momentarily overrode the chemical clarity of the S9. This was not possible. It was a mistake, a corrupted file, a cruel digital doppelganger. Denial rose in him like a fever, a desperate internal scream trying to drown out the terrifying implications. His eyes, burning with a dry, frantic intensity, dropped to the text log. The notes were brief, clinical, and damning. Cycle 1, initiated. Subject C. Ko Silva shows exceptional baseline receptivity. Rapid integration, cognitive metrics exceed projected peaks. Duration, 11 weeks. Termination event, catatonic episode followed by acute retrograde amnesia. Full memory wipe and reintegration successful. Cycle 2, reinitiated. Enhanced synthesis protocols. Cognitive output remarkable but emotional blunting and irritability noted earlier in cycle. Duration, 9 weeks. Termination event, psychotic break. Subject. Perceived research team as hostile entities. Required physical sedation. Memory wipe and reintegration successful. The words were not just on the screen. They were etching themselves onto the inside of his skull. The inexplicable gaps in his own memory, a forgotten vacation, a year of his life that always felt hazy and indistinct, suddenly had a name. The deep-seated, almost primal familiarity he had felt with the S9 project from his first day, the ease with which he navigated its complexities. It wasn't talent or intuition. It was muscle memory. The irritability, the emotional numbness, the nightmares, they weren't new developments. They were the echoes of previous collapses, the fault lines in a psyche that had been shattered and glued back together too many times. His sense of self, the fragile narrative of Ko Silva that he had clung to his entire life, shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. He was not the brilliant underdog uncovering a conspiracy. He was the conspiracy. He was a lab rat who had been running the same maze over and over, each time believing it was his first time, each time being praised for his remarkable intuition. The praise from Dr. Aris, the looks of respect from his colleagues. It was all part of the experiment, the careful conditioning of a subject who didn't know he was the primary specimen. The man in the chair, breathing the sterile air and trembling before the monitor, was not a person. He was a folder labeled Subject C, a collection of data points and failed cycles, a ghost haunting the machine of his own life. The shock gave way to a vast, howling emptiness, a void where his identity had once been. He had gone looking for the truth about S9, and he had found the truth about himself. He was its most profound and most repeated failure. The ghost in the machine was no longer a metaphor. It was him, a consciousness haunting the hollowed-out shell of a life that had been lived, erased, and relived in a sterile, repeating loop. The photograph of his own face, the clinical notes detailing his own destruction. They were not isolated facts, but pieces of a horrifying puzzle whose full picture was only now beginning to coalesce in his fractured mind. The shock had hollowed him out, leaving behind a cold, analytical clarity, the last gift of the S9 coursing through his veins. He had to see it all. He had to understand the full architecture of his own damnation. He returned to the Subject C folder, his movements now those of an automaton, a ghost driven by a morbid need to read its own autopsy report. He cross-referenced the termination logs with the main project server, pulling personnel records, security access logs, and even the building's energy consumption charts. The data points, when laid out on a timeline, formed a pattern as precise and chilling as a chemical formula. The gaps in his memory, the lost years, the inexplicable sense of déjà vu that had always plagued him, they were not anomalies. They were the seams. Each cycle followed the same brutal arc. He was integrated into the project as a new, promising junior researcher, his past carefully constructed by the corporation's psychological operatives. The initial dose of S9 would unlock his latent, preconditioned genius, leading to a period of intense productivity and corporate praise. He would be lauded, made to feel indispensable, his deep-seated need for validation expertly manipulated to keep him compliant and dosing. Then the cracks would appear, the irritability, the paranoia, the emotional detachment, the perceptual distortions. The corporation's logs noted these not as tragedies but as predictable metrics. They were the canaries in the coal mine, signaling the impending collapse. The termination events were varied in their manifestation but identical in their outcome. A psychotic break during a lab meeting, a catatonic state discovered in his apartment, a violent episode requiring sedation. In every instance, the logs coldly noted the same procedure: neural stabilization, full memory engram suppression, reintegration into Project S9 under new identity construct. They would wipe his mind clean, scrub his memories back to a manufactured baseline, and drop him back into the maze, a clean slate ready to be written on again. He was a renewable resource, a cognitive battery to be drained, recharged, and drained again. The most devastating revelation came when he accessed the hidden medical subroutines. Each cycle of S9 use didn't just burn through his sanity. It consumed something far more fundamental: his cognitive reserve. The compound worked by forcibly accelerating neural pathways, but it did so by burning through the brain's natural longevity, consuming years of future cognitive function in a matter of weeks. The logs estimated that each full cycle consumed the equivalent of 7 to 10 years of natural neurological aging. He had undergone at least 4 documented cycles. He was not a young man on the verge of a brilliant career. He was a fragile, prematurely aged shell, a man who had lived multiple lifetimes of intellectual decay in the span of a few corporate years. The brilliant mind he now possessed was a final, desperate flare, a supernova burning the last of his fuel. The headaches, the lapses, the creeping sense of dissolution, they were not warnings of a future collapse. They were the echoes of past ones, the cumulative damage of a psyche that had been shattered and reassembled one too many times. He was not heading for a breakdown. He was living in the permanent aftershock of multiple, meticulously documented mental annihilations. The cycle was the entire truth. He was not a scientist. He was the experiment. And the experiment was almost over. The sterile silence of the lab was the first thing to fracture. It began as a subtle shift, a change in pressure so minute only a mind tuned by S9 could perceive it. The low, omnipresent hum of the climate control system hitched, its frequency altering by a fraction of a hertz. Across the vast, open-plan laboratory, the soft green indicator lights on the biometric scanners at every airlock door flickered once, then snapped to a uniform, unwavering red. A synthesized female voice, calm and utterly devoid of urgency, echoed from the overhead speakers. Security Protocol Delta 9 is now in effect. Please remain at your workstation. Around him, his colleagues looked up, their expressions a mixture of mild annoyance and confusion. They saw a routine drill, a minor inconvenience in their structured day. But Kao saw the truth. He saw the way the security cameras mounted in the upper corners of the room pivoted with a silent, predatory grace, their lenses no longer scanning in random sweeps but focusing, one by one, directly on him. A cold spike of adrenaline, sharp and clean, pierced the S9-induced clarity that cocooned his thoughts. They knew. The system had finally correlated the anomalous data, the unauthorized server access, the patterns in his work output that mirrored the Prometheus subjects, the tiny, regular depletion of an S9 reserve vial. The lockdown wasn't a drill. It was a trap being sprung, and he was the prey caught in its center. His enhanced perception, which moments before had felt like a cage of paranoia, now became his only weapon. He saw the world not as it was, but as a matrix of threats and opportunities. The 2 security personnel stationed at the main lab entrance had their hands resting on the butts of their non-lethal pulse weapons. Their body language was relaxed, but their heart rates, perceptible to him as a faint, rapid thrumming from across the room, betrayed their readiness. He moved without conscious thought, his body responding to the flow of data his mind was processing. As the nearest guard took a step toward him, Kao was already in motion. He didn't run, he flowed, his movements a study in economical precision. A cart of sensitive glassware stood between him and the guard. With a slight, almost imperceptible shift of his weight, he nudged it. It wasn't a hard push, but it was perfectly calculated. The cart rolled forward, its path intersecting with the guard's just as the man took his second step. The collision was minimal, but it was enough. The guard stumbled, his attention fractured for a single, crucial second. In that sliver of time, Kao was past him, a ghost slipping through a closing gap. Alarms began to blare, a more urgent, strident sound than the calm voice. Strobes of crimson light pulsed through the lab, casting the terrified faces of his colleagues in a hellish glow. He became a darting shadow in the epileptic rhythm of the lights. He could see the infrared beams of the motion sensors crisscrossing the corridor ahead, a lethal web invisible to any normal eye. He dropped, rolled beneath one, twisted his body to contort between two others. His movements a fluid dance dictated by the geometry of the security grid. He could hear the heavy, booted footfalls of reinforcements converging from both ends of the hallway, their radio chatter a distorted buzz in his heightened hearing. They were coordinating, trying to box him in. He slid into an emergency stairwell, the heavy fire door slamming shut behind him, muffling the cacophony. For a moment, there was only the sound of his own breathing and the frantic hammering of his heart. But the respite was illusory. He could hear the distinct, metallic clang of armored boots on the stairs above and below him. They were in the stairwells too. There was no safe corner of the facility left. He was a rat in a labyrinth, and the walls were alive with hunters. The realization crashed down upon him with the weight of a physical blow. This was not an arrest. The logs of the Prometheus Protocol had been clear about what happened to subjects who became problematic. They were not fired or imprisoned. They were terminated, their files scrubbed, their existence neatly folded into the unfortunate casualties of aggressive research. He was not being hunted for punishment. He was being hunted for deletion. The race was no longer for truth or recognition. It was a desperate, frantic race for the most basic of things, the next breath, the next second of life. Time, which had once stretched out so languidly around him, was now a burning fuse, and he was sprinting directly up its length, feeling the heat at his heels. The city's underbelly breathed in the spaces between things, in the damp alleyways slick with runoff, beneath the groaning overpasses where shadows pooled like oil, and within the skeletal remains of industries long abandoned. It was into this interstitial world that Ko fled, a ghost escaping one machine only to be swallowed by a larger, more indifferent one. The S9 still burned in his veins, a cold fire that turned the night into a hyper-defined blueprint of threats and hiding places. He could see the heat signatures of sleeping vagrants through brick walls, hear the skittering of rats 2 blocks away as clearly as if they were at his feet, and calculate the precise trajectory of a security drone's patrol path from the subtle Doppler shift of its rotors. He was a fugitive operating on a different sensory plane, a man seeing the matrix of the world while everyone else saw only the surface. He moved with an unnerving, fluid grace, his body an instrument perfectly tuned to the data streaming into his mind. A flicker of a camera's red light on a corner was a wall to be avoided. The distant wail of a siren was a current to be ridden, its sound masking the scuff of his shoes on wet asphalt. He used the city's own noise and light pollution as a cloak, slipping through the brightest, noisiest thoroughfares where he was just another blur in the urban chaos, before diving back into the protective silence of the dark. He was a paradox, utterly exposed, yet completely invisible, a secret hiding in plain sight. But the fortress of his mind was under siege from within. As he pressed his back against the cold, graffitied concrete of a drainage culvert, catching his breath, the memories came. They were not recollections, but visceral invasions. One moment he was Ko, the fugitive, the next he was another version of himself, staring at a different set of laboratory walls, a different set of condescending smiles. A flash of a white room, the smell of antiseptic so strong it burned his nostrils, and the crushing weight of a loneliness so absolute it felt like a physical vacuum. Then another, the sensation of cold leather straps on his wrists, a scream that was his own echoing in a soundproof chamber, and the terrifying knowledge that the person screaming was a stranger wearing his face. These were not his memories. They were the ghosts of the other Kos, the ones who had already run this race and lost. Their fear, their despair, their final, fragmented thoughts bled into his own, a psychic poison that eroded the edges of his present self. He clutched his head, his fingers digging into his temples as if he could physically hold his mind together. The brilliant, Data-rich perception granted by the S9 began to flicker like a failing bulb. The precise heat signatures would blur into amorphous smears of color. The calculated drone paths would suddenly seem to double, then triple, creating a labyrinth of impossible trajectories. He would find himself standing in an alley, unsure of how he had gotten there, the last few minutes a complete blank. The cityscape, once a clear map, would sometimes warp, the buildings leaning in at impossible angles, their windows staring at him like 1,000 accusing eyes. He was losing coherence, his consciousness a page upon which too many stories had been written, one bleeding into the next until no single narrative remained legible. He was on the run not just from the corporation's hunters, but from the collapsing architecture of his own soul, each step forward taking him deeper into the haunted ruins of all the men he had already been. The ghosts were no longer confined to memory. They had taken form and substance, stepping out from the crumbling architecture of his mind to walk beside him in the tangible world. They were all versions of Ko, a spectral procession of his own failures. One, with hollowed eyes and a lab coat stained with phantom grime, would shuffle alongside him, whispering frantic equations that dissolved into static before they could be solved. Another, younger and blazing with the arrogant fire of that first dose, would stride ahead, turning back to sneer at his present weakened state. A third would simply sit in the corner of whatever damp, forgotten space Ko had claimed for the hour, rocking back and forth, repeating a single chilling phrase in a dead monotone. The occupant is gone. The occupant is gone. They were not mere hallucinations. They were an audience to his unraveling, a Greek chorus composed of his own erased selves, and their silent, judging presence was a torture more exquisite than any the corporate hunters could devise. Time, once a river he could navigate, had become a shattered pane of glass. He would blink and find the sun had leaped across the sky, the shadows in the alley having stretched and contorted without his notice. He would huddle in the rusted cab of a derelict truck, watching a single drop of water form and fall from a cracked pipe, counting the seconds as a way to anchor himself, only to realize with a jolt of terror that he had no memory of the count beginning, or of the hours that had clearly passed. The lapses were not voids of unconsciousness, but stolen segments of existence. He would come back to himself mid-action, his fingers bloody from trying to pry open a sealed dumpster, or his body braced for a fight against an opponent that was not there. The city became a dreamscape where cause and effect had been severed, and he was a phantom adrift in its illogical currents. Huddled in the dripping darkness of a storm drain, the reality of his situation finally broke through the cacophony in his mind. He was a collapsing star. The brilliant S9-fueled light was the last violent expenditure of his remaining mass, and the gravitational pull of his own impending implosion was now inescapable. He could feel it, a sucking vortex at the core of his being, pulling his thoughts, his memories, his very sense of I into a single, dense point of nothingness. Ghosts, the time lapses, the warping perception, they were not the illness but the symptoms of the final terminal stage. He was not just losing his mind, he was witnessing the active demolition of his consciousness. This stark confrontation left him with a choice, a final, desperate calculation. One path was to seek help, to stumble into a hospital to try and form the words that would explain the corporation, the S9, the cycles. But the thought was a bitter laugh that died in his throat. They would see a raving, emaciated drug addict, a victim of his own hubris. He would be sedated, institutionalized, and the corporation would quietly collect him, finishing the job with a final, thorough memory wipe. It was not salvation. It was a more sanitized form of deletion. The other path was to embrace the very thing that had doomed him. One last, full dose. Not a microdose to sustain a fraying facade, but a triumphant, all-consuming flood. It would burn the last of his cognitive reserve in a single, glorious conflagration. It would either grant him the transcendent clarity needed to achieve some final, meaningful act, to strike back, to expose the truth, or it would simply be the beautiful, catastrophic fire in which he chose to be consumed. It was the gambit of a man with nothing left to lose, a final, defiant roar into the void, even if that roar was the very thing that would unmoor him from existence entirely. The vial in his pocket felt impossibly heavy, a cold, dense star whose gravity now pulled at his every thought. The crossroads was not ahead. It was here in the dark, with the ghosts of his past selves as witnesses, and the weight of a final, terrible decision in his hand. Dust motes, stirred by his frantic entrance, danced like dying stars in the single shard of moonlight piercing the warehouse's broken roof. Ko stood frozen in the vast, echoing silence, his back pressed against the cold, corrugated steel of the door he had just barred. The hunt had funneled him here, to this cavernous terminus of rust and shadows. The frantic beat of his heart was a wild drum against his ribs, a stark contrast to the absolute stillness that now enveloped him. He was cornered. Outside, the distant wail of sirens was closing in, weaving a net of sound around the building. Inside, there was only the hollow, metallic groan of the structure settling, and the three distinct paths that now branched from the ruins of his life, each one leading into a different shade of oblivion. The first path glowed with the cold, righteous fire of vengeance. The stolen data drive was a hard, rectangular weight in his pocket, a sliver of captured truth containing the entire damning history of S9, the erased primate trials, the Prometheus protocol, his own file as subject C. He could expose it all. With a few keystrokes, he could unleash this digital plague upon the corporation, sending it cascading into the global consciousness, a scream of truth to shatter their carefully constructed silence. The moral weight of this choice was immense. It was the path of the martyr, the whistleblower who sacrifices himself for the greater good. He could die here in this warehouse, but his death would be a detonation that would scar the corporation forever. Yet, the data was not a pure, unsullied weapon. Leaking it would not just implicate the faceless executives. It would expose the names and photographs of every failed human subject, every ghost from the protocol. He would be dragging the erased and the broken back into the light for public consumption, turning their private torment into a global spectacle. Was he saving them, or violating their memory one final time? The second path was a seductive whisper from the vial he now held in his palm. The pearlescent liquid caught the sliver of moonlight, shimmering with a promise that had become a curse. One final, full dose. Not the cautious microdoses that had sustained his fraying sanity, but a total, unreserved surrender. He knew what it offered, a transcendent clarity, a final, blinding surge of genius that would make the world's complexities seem like child's play. In that state, he could engineer an escape that defied physics or craft a data leak so elegant and untraceable it would be a work of art. It was the path of apotheosis, the chance to become, for one last, glorious moment, the god the substance had always promised he could be. But the cost was absolute. It would be the final transaction, burning the last dregs of his cognitive reserve, consuming the final fragments of Ko Silva. He would achieve his goal, but the man who achieved it would be unmade in the process, his identity erased not by corporate wipes, but by the very power he sought to wield. He would become a perfect, brilliant instrument, and in doing so cease to be a person at all. The third path was the most human and therefore the most terrifying: escape, a raw, animalistic flight for survival. He could abandon the data, discard the vial, and use the last of his waning, non-enhanced instincts to try and slip through the tightening cordon. He could melt into the city's endless flow of forgotten people, to live as a ghost haunted by the truth he carried. This path carried the moral weight of silence. It was the choice to prioritize his own fragile, flickering existence over the cosmic justice of exposure. He would be choosing to live with the knowledge, to bear the unbearable weight of what he knew, all while the machine of the corporation continued its work, creating new subjects C and consuming new minds. It was the path of the survivor, but it demanded a strength he was no longer sure he possessed, the strength to remember, to endure, and to live with the guilt of inaction. The ghosts of his former selves seemed to gather in the shadows, each one a silent advocate for a different choice. The hollow-eyed specter pointed a trembling finger at the data drive. The arrogant, blazing ghost held out its hands for the vial. The catatonic one, rocking in the corner, simply stared into the middle distance, representing the numb void of mere survival. Kao's breath plumed in the frigid air, each exhalation a prayer, a curse, a surrender. The sirens were at the perimeter now, their lights painting the warehouse walls in frantic strokes of red and blue. The crossroads was not a place on a map, but a final, desperate convergence within his soul. Every second was a grain of sand falling, and the weight of the choice, with all its profound and terrible consequences, was his alone to bear. The decision was not a choice, but a culmination. It was the final, logical conclusion of a journey that had begun with a desperate desire to be seen, and had ended in the absolute understanding that to be seen was to be erased. The sirens were a deafening corona around the warehouse, their lights strobing through the broken windows, painting the rust and dust in the frantic colors of emergency. In that maelstrom of sound and light, a profound calm descended upon Kao. The ghosts of his former selves fell silent, their conflicting whispers dissolving into a single, resonant hum of acceptance. There was no more Kao Silva to save, no past to reclaim, no future to fear. There was only the equation, and the solution was beautiful in its simplicity. He would burn the last of himself to cast a light so brilliant it would blind the monster in its den. His hands were steady as he uncapped the syringe, the motion practiced, ritualistic. The pearlescent liquid, a captured fragment of a false dawn, shimmered as it filled the chamber. There was no hesitation, no last-minute fear. The needle was not an instrument of destruction, but a key. He pressed it into his vein, a final, deliberate act of self-annihilation. The world did not explode, it unfolded. It was a silent, blinding surge of pure genius, an epistemological Big Bang that obliterated the confines of his skull and set his consciousness adrift in the raw data stream of the universe. The rusting warehouse, the screaming sirens, the very molecules of the air, they all resolved into their constituent mathematical truths. He was no longer thinking, he was knowing. The complex encryption protecting the stolen data was not a barrier but a simple pattern, a child's puzzle he solved with a flicker of will. He saw the global network not as a series of cables and servers, but as a luminous, living nervous system. With a thought, he reached out and touched it. The data, the primate trials, the human protocols, his own damning file, did not simply upload. It blossomed. It erupted from 1,000 points of failure simultaneously, a digital supernova engineered by a mind that had, for one transcendent moment, become indistinguishable from a god. It flooded news servers, leaked into academic forums, blossomed across social media grids, and embedded itself in the core architecture of the corporation's own public-facing websites. It was an inescapable truth, a ghost not in one machine but in all of them, a scream that would echo in the infosphere for years to come. He had not just leaked the data, he had woven it into the very fabric of global memory. And as the last packet of information was cast into the digital ether, the blinding light of his genius began to flicker. The unraveling was not a collapse, but a gentle, inexorable detachment. The mathematical certainties that had structured reality softened, their sharp edges blurring. The luminous network of the world faded, its connections dissolving like smoke. He felt no fear, no pain, only a profound and placid indifference. The man who had been Kao Silva was now just a quiet observer, watching the demolition of his own mind from a place of serene, infinite distance. He did not fight it. He embraced the void, the beautiful, silent emptiness where the ghosts could no longer follow and the hunters could no longer find him. The sirens faded into a meaningless hum, then into silence. The strobing lights dissolved into a uniform, soft gray. He was becoming a legend, a cautionary tale whispered in corporate boardrooms and dark web forums. The man who had unmasked a giant and vanished into the myth he created. But the legend would never know the man. The memories of a laboratory, of a desire for recognition, of fear and love and loss, slipped away like sand through open fingers, each one a dying star winking out in the vast, darkening sky of his consciousness. He was left with nothing but the ambiguous devastation he had wrought, a perfect, empty vessel adrift on a sea of silent, forgotten light.